weeks ago, started on this wonderful adventure talking about marriage and all that good stuff, right? Well, I introduced to you 1 Corinthians chapter 7 about 3 weeks ago. And then I realized that I was in over my head because I had to cover more stuff before we got into that. So what ended up happening was I preached on the subject of sex more than I had ever preached on that subject. About 2 weeks ago now, Kevin preached last Sunday on Genesis 1:1. And now I'm going to get back into marriage again. And all the stuff around that subject. I'm going to talk about this stuff. But I have a couple of verses that I want to share with you before we get into this subject. It's almost like a piece of advice on the subject. I'm taking 2 verses. One in the book of Acts, chapter 20. I'm going to show this verse to you right now. So go ahead and turn on over to the book of Acts, chapter 20. And I'm going to read a verse with you here. Now, this verse, to me, is probably one of my favorite verses as it pertains to the Apostle Paul and his overall attitude, kind of like his disposition on life and his disposition on his ministry. And he makes this statement approaching his journey into Rome, which, of course, he goes to Rome as a prisoner. He is arrested for preaching the gospel in Jerusalem, and this was told to him in the form of prophetic sayings. There were some prophets that had told him, and he himself received the prophetic message, basically telling him, hey, Paul, when you go to Jerusalem, you're going to be arrested. And so as he's on his way back to the promised land, or the land that his people were at in Jerusalem, he stops by Ephesus for a little while, and that's where we are. And he's going to spend some time with the Ephesian Christians, but then he gives this address to the Ephesian elders. And in the midst of it, he makes this statement. And it's in direct relation to the fact that he's aware of the fact that when he goes to Jerusalem, he's going to be arrested. And now most of us would say, I ain't going to Jerusalem then, because I don't want to be a prisoner, right? You know, because the rest of us are smart enough to see that. Well, Paul wasn't smart enough, evidently, you know? And so he actually gives us his perspective. So it's Acts 20 and verse 24. He says about this prophecy, but none of these things move me, neither count I my life dear unto myself, so that I might finish my course with joy, and the ministry which I have received of the Lord Jesus, to testify the gospel of the grace of God. So you can see here that Paul's disposition is, I don't care. I don't care what happens to me. It doesn't matter to me who tries to arrest me. It doesn't matter what anybody says to me. It doesn't matter what anyone else thinks. I want to do what I think is right, what I know is right. So one of the things that I was going to say was, when we talk about subjects like this, subjects like marriage, it is probably one of the most sensitive subjects that can be discussed in modern day America. And we humans can get sensitive sometimes, and we kind of can take ourselves a little too seriously sometimes. And it's just not conducive for truth. When we allow our emotions to take control, now I'm not saying anything against emotions. Emotions are necessary. We have emotions. We just have to learn how to use them for good. And we also are living in the era of the participation award. You know, I kind of joke about that from time to time. Like when I was going to school, if there was a competition, we were all winners. It's like you're all winners when there was only one winner. And it was done to spare the feelings of the people that weren't quite as fast, weren't quite as smart, whatever the situation that may have been, or those that didn't work as hard. And that was actually something, there's actual research on this, just so you know. There's actual research on this that created a very spoiled generation, and this is well documented. It was not good to do this to children because now that they're in the workforce, they need so much special treatment, and they treat their bosses like their bosses are their abusive parent that didn't give them enough attention, and all those kinds of things. This is just documented stuff. And when it comes to the gospel, when it comes to the teachings of Christ, there's a lot of things that we just have to realize and understand. We are all wrong somewhere in our lives. We all need help somewhere in our lives. And just because society is one way doesn't make it right. Just because society 50 years ago said, hey, divorce is cool, ain't no problem with it, doesn't mean it's just cool and there's no problem with it. It's a big problem in society right now. And it's caused a huge issue in our country and in many of our ability to be able to see truth. So we ought not take ourselves so seriously on this kind of stuff and just look for what the truth says on these things. God's the one watching out for us. The government isn't really watching out for you. It's there for a reason. It's a good thing. We know that by the teachings of the Apostle Paul in the book of Romans. We know it's good, but the government don't care about your soul. Society don't care about your soul, and the billboards don't care about your soul either. Neither do the TV shows. They care about numbers. When you step through these doors, this is a safe place. This is a good place. But this ain't no theater. I'm not up here performing and entertaining you. I do entertaining things sometimes. You know? And I look like the front cover of GQ magazine, I know that. But I am not here to entertain any of it. And when I speak some of these things to you, it is because when you come here, I care about your soul because God told me to. I want you to care about my soul too. If I'm ever off course, I want you to bust me up. Just like I'm about to bust some of you up this morning, right? I'm trying to bust you up every Sunday. I also always give you the Christ because the Christ is everything. So let's not take ourselves too seriously, like the Apostle Paul said. These things don't move me. I just want to do what the gospel tells me to do. What God tells me to do. I'm going to show you another verse in preparation for going into some of this content we're about to get into. It's Proverbs chapter 28. Now, Proverbs is a little bit easier on the context because it's a book of Proverbs, but a bunch of wise sayings, you know. Many of them are somewhat isolated. They all have a type of context, but Proverbs chapter 28, verse 26. We're getting toward the end of the book of Proverbs. Solomon is just writing down all this good stuff that God gave him. And tucked within the pages of the book of Proverbs is Proverbs 28, verse 26. So I'm going to read this with you now. He that trusts in his own heart is a fool, but whoso walks wisely, he shall be delivered. So I'm going to reread the first half of it especially there. He that trusts in his own heart is a fool. Now, this is most definitely against the conventional wisdom. It sounds pretty nice when people say follow your heart. That's a real common saying that you hear a lot of the time. You see it hanging up on people's walls. You know, people use it in their literature, and teachers will tell that to students. Follow your heart. It's just this real common thing, and it sounds real nice, but there is one problem with it that I want you be aware of right now. There's just one big problem with it. It's a lie. It's no good. And it's the reason why we're in the mess that we're in America. Because too many people followed their heart and didn't follow God. See what I'm saying? Like, it's one of those statements that is kind of transferable. You know, like when the pain is real intense, you don't want to follow your heart when you're going through immense pain and treacherous agony. Like, you follow your heart. But first, took my heart is telling me to feel immense pain and agony. So just let it rip, man. No. It's telling me to feel all kinds of pain and agony. Is that the kind of place you want your heart to take you? Is that really, of course, when that's happening, you understand and realize don't follow the heart, because you need to look for something that's going to fulfill, something that's going to actually give you something that's actually worth investing in. But then when, like, the butterflies and the naked babies with wings start floating around, it's like, well, I'm just going to follow this wherever it takes me. And then you're like, oh, well, suddenly I forgot all the pain and agony that my heart caused me, like yesterday. And now I'm going through all this, now I'm going through this heart stuff and acting like, well, I'm going to follow it now. And that's just ridiculous. But that's the way we people are. We have trouble with our memory. You remember Peter? Jesus, I will follow you wherever you go. I would be willing to die for you. Later that night, no, I don't know the guy. But no, I've never heard of him before. Jesus? Jesus who? I was like earlier that afternoon, and he said, Jesus, I would die with you. How quickly he forgot, right? So that's the way we people are. That's why we need this stuff. See what I'm saying? You can't count on your heart. How many in this room would love to stand before a judge in the court of law who just followed his heart on the matter? That's why we have law, because the law is supposed to tell him what and how to make a decision, not based off of, well, I don't like the look in your eye, man, so that's, 20 years of prison. Like, that would be horrible. None of us want to live in that world. But you make yourself live in that world all the time. And people, when it comes to the most momentous decision, one of the most momentous decisions in their lives, the decision of marriage, treat it like it's the college application. No, they don't even take it that seriously. Like, college application, that's kind of serious. That can determine a lot of things, right? People don't even take it that seriously. It's like, what could go wrong? A lot. Just take a look at human society, and you shall see what we have done. And there is no single person or couple or anybody that's the one to blame. We humans have goofed things up. Now, this just happens to be one of the more hypersensitive subjects to discuss, and that's why I'm taking it very delicately. And you're like, you're not being very delicate at all. You're saying fart and stuff, man. That's not very delicate. But seriously, though, in all seriousness, this subject is no different from any other. It's just a very highly sensitive subject, and we need to start teaching one another and the next generation a whole lot more about this stuff, so that they don't repeat some of these mistakes, because I know many people who have been through some of the most horrific of things. Wouldn't wish it on the worst enemies. So let us pray one for another on these things. Let us teach our children on these things. Let these things just reverberate. This is going to be, and I hope that there's preachers all across the land. I fear that there's a lot of preachers that are not covering this stuff. So let's get into it. I want you to turn your Bibles on over to 1 Corinthians chapter 7. 1 Corinthians chapter 7. Now, just for sake of time, I am going to cover some of the highlights, some of the things that are moving into my life and into my consciousness as it pertains to our subject out of 1 Corinthians. Now, 1 Corinthians is its own epistle that the Apostle Paul wrote. It's, in my opinion, one of the more unique of his epistles. It's actually probably the most organized of them all. And the reason why is because he was talking to people that were straying very far away from what God had originally intended for them. And so as a result of that, if you just take a look at the third chapter, in the first couple of verses, the Apostle Paul actually tells them, you guys are acting like babies, so I have to treat you like babies. So he makes it very organized, and he makes it very straightforward and writes it almost as if law and rules. And the 7th chapter, he's dealing with the subject of marriage because evidently some of the people in Corinth, some of the Christians in Corinth had asked him for his advice on the matter and also what God says on the matter. So one of the unique things about this chapter is it's one of the few chapters in New Testament scripture that I'm aware of where the author is actually going to say, so here's what God says, but I'm also going to share my opinion with you. Most New Testament scripture is just, this is what God says, period. But then when you have a subject like this, where you have the most intimate of relationships, supposed to be one of the most intimate and one of the greatest of relationships between two humans, you're going to have a whole lot of drama, right? A whole lot of specific circumstances that are going to be difficult to cover all things that pertain to every relationship, because no two relationships are the same. So what the Apostle Paul does is he shares his opinion. The way I have selected to cover this with you this morning is to actually cover Paul's opinion first, what he refers to as his opinion. And he, like I said, he makes it clear this is his opinion. And it's I kind of say it somewhat humorously, and you're going to understand the humor based off of just the overall panoramic view of marriage and whatnot. As far as I know, we don't know Paul's past marital relationship, if any, as far as I know. But I'll tell you right now, it seems like he had a pretty rough marriage based on the way he writes. Because this is the Apostle Paul's advice on marriage. And I'm going to cover this with you. I'm going to show you where he says it. You know what his advice is? It can be summed up in 3 words. No, 2 words. No, 3 words, my bad. Don't do it. Like the Apostle Paul, the man who wrote like over half the New Testament, one of the greatest champions of faith. Man, he totally turned his life around. At one time was the greatest enemy of the church. Totally turned his life around. Absolute dedication to the gospel of Christ and the preaching thereof. Missionary journey. And when it comes to the subject of marriage, his advice is, I wouldn't do it. That's what he says. Take a look. Verse 1. Now concerning the things whereof you wrote unto me, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. Basically, it's good to just not even mess with it. Just leave it alone. Just live your life, man. That's what he says. Verse 7. For I desire that all men were as I myself. And that means single, because he himself is single. So he says it would be better for all men were to be like me. Verse 11. And if she depart, let her remain unmarried. Verse 27. Are you bound to a wife? Seek not to be loosed. Are you loose from a wife? Seek not a wife. Again, just I'm just exhausting it just so you know for sure that Paul said, don't do it. That was his advice. And then the last couple of verses of the chapter, verses 39 and 40. Well, wife is bound by laws as long as her husband lives, but if her husband be dead, she is at liberty to be married to whom she desires, only in the Lord. Verse 40, he says, but she is happier if she so abide after my judgment. And I think also that I have the Spirit of God. Another statement that kind of cracks me up that he makes there, and I think also that I have the Spirit of God on this one. But he actually says that she'll be happier if she just stays single. So that's the Apostle Paul's advice on the matter. Now, I want to cover now the reason why, or at least one of the reasons why he would make this statement. And it is one of those subjects that we could go on and on and on about, but I want to cover a couple, or just a little bit with you this morning. I really do believe, now, Corinth was probably very similar to modern day America. As in, there was a lot of promiscuity. There was a lot of anything goes kind of mentality. There was probably a lot of rat's nest situations that were going on in a lot of people's relationships. And so the Apostle Paul was willing to just go ahead and tell these Christians, I'm going to tell you right now, if you really want to just live a successful Christian life, it's going to be easier for you to just not worry about this situation. It's such a loaded thing in this day and age. Now, this may not have been applicable maybe 100 years ago or something, when the culture was totally different. When the general rule was one man per one woman per life, and people just didn't mess with that. That's just the way it was in those days. The advice probably would have been totally different. And then when the situation totally shifts and changes, and you can see in society that marriage is, by and large, the majority of marriages are not successful because, for whatever reason, so many people are so spoiled, so many people are so selfish, so many people make decisions with their heart rather than with the wisdom of God. And that's just the way society has become. It just keeps on spiraling out of control. I want to show you something, and this really is one of the main reasons why I think the Apostle Paul says don't do it. It's because you can see what happens when sexual promiscuity takes control of the land, and it becomes absolutely, well, not absolutely, of course, because there are successful marriages. I don't want to say use the word absolute, but it becomes a total detriment to the bulk of society. Now, where's the evidence for that? It's all around you. I want to show you a verse. Put your bookmark in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. Keep your bookmark there for a second. I'm going to venture off back into the Old Testament again. I want to show you something out of there. It's Exodus chapter 34. It's actually right there in the context of the memory verse that we have for our kids program. Extremely rich text. Well, I want to show you something out of here, and it's going to shed a little bit of light on something that helps us understand the consequences of departing from God's wisdom. Exodus 34, this is a direct response of the God of heaven, God Jehovah, or Yahweh, having a direct communication with Moses after they were waiting for 40 days when Moses was up in Mount Sinai. And they got so impatient that they told Aaron, hey, we don't know what happened to Moses. We don't know if he's gone back. So they made a golden calf, and they started worshiping this golden calf. And what ended up happening was God says to Moses, if people are going nuts down there, go back and set things straight. He goes back down. Now, naturally, Moses is pretty concerned about the situation. And he actually has this dialogue. It's written in chapter 33 as if it's like this face-to-face interaction between him and God. It's an amazing story. I highly recommend you refresh your memory and read this story again on your own. Chapter 33 and 34. And Moses says to God, I can't take these people. And it's almost like he's making a special request to the God of heaven, like, really show me who you are. Like, really, like, give me real, true evidence that you're going to be with me, because I'm scared. Like, that's the way I read it. And so what happens is God passes over him. He says, you can't see my face, but I'm going to put you in the cleft of the rock. I'm going to put my hand over you, and I'm going to pass over you, and then you can look at my back, but you can't look at my face because you'll melt, man. I'm telling you. That's kind of the way it's being represented here. And then after he does this, verses 6 and 7, well, let's read verses 5 with it as well. Then God makes this self-proclamation. So I want to read verses 5 through 7. So in Exodus 34, verse 5, it says, and the Lord descended in the cloud and stood with him there and proclaimed the name of the Lord. And the Lord passed by before him and proclaimed, the Lord God, merciful and gracious, long-suffering and abundant in goodness and truth, keeping mercy for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, that will by no means clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children and upon the children's children unto the third and to the fourth generation. Now, the stuff that we like out of this is verse 6. We love verse 6 because it's who God is. It's the richness of his character. We know in the New Testament era that this is a direct representation of who the Christ is. But I want to show you now this statement that's placed in here about the third and fourth generation. There is going to be a type of consequence on a father's sin down to the children of the third and fourth generation. That's real interesting right there. And this is something that you can take as truth just because God said it, okay? When we do something, when we harm our children in any kind of way, when we commit an atrocity that they see, it's going to affect their lives. There's a trickle effect. Maybe know that just from Adam. Adam sinned, and look at the world now, right? And that's more than 3 or 4 generations. It's just sin just compounds and gets worse and worse and worse as time goes on. But it ebbs and flows in different ways and different styles, and this is actually something that has been documented. You can see it in lots of psychological studies, and they use it with even something as simple as rats and critters. That if something happens to a certain critter, you see the effect of that for 3 or 4 generations later. This is just fact. God said it thousands of years ago, and it takes us. Well, we have to study rats before we really believe it. But you don't need to study rats to believe it. It's just some neat, interesting confirmation of God's truth. The deeper you dig, the more you find out, oh yeah, God was right. It's just incredible. So there was a guy who did a study, and it was an unbiased study. His name was Unwin. I don't know his first name. I've just done a little bit of research, but I have found a couple of interesting facts about human society based off of just some of this research. And what he did was he studied 80-something cultures, and he studied the effect of sexual revolution on these cultures, these communities. And in general, every culture that adopted sexual freedom, as in anything goes, that culture collapsed in 3 generations, including cultures like the Greek Empire, the Roman Empire. Those are the more popular ones that we make reference to. And guess what? The study was done in the 30s, before our sexual revolution happened in our great country, America. Now, his research determined that God was right. that there will be massive repercussions for when certain sins are practiced, and 3 generations down the road, it's going to be looking real ugly. Well, we are in the midst of it right now. And the reason why I believe that Paul would advise on the subject of marriage so much, and the reason why a couple of Sundays ago I covered the subject of sexual revolution and sexual immorality, is because it is super important. So important that it has caused so much havoc on our lives and on our children's lives that there is really hardly any way to turn back. And the amount of troubles and psychological and emotional issues that it has brought upon entire generations is irreversible on a physical level. Now, the Christ always is able to heal. But I wanted to cover this with you in this way and show you how important the subject is. Don't be all getting sensitive. Don't be thinking, well, this is just true. This is just fact. Marriage is not some, like, going to the local car dealership and looking for a car. That's how people treat the subject of who you're going to spend the rest of your life with. And it has been so destructive that many people don't even know if they want to live anymore because of it. And it has spiraled out of control to the point that people don't know what gender they are anymore. And it all began with people forgetting who God is, what He said, and what He said we need to do and honor. And marriage is honorable, and mankind has spat upon. And look what it's doing to your people, to your country, to your own family. I don't preach this stuff lightly. This is for real. And it is so important that we must make it an absolute priority in the way we teach our kids. And I am not messing around on this. You got your bookmark in chapter 7 of 1 Corinthians. I want to take a look at it with you again. 1 Corinthians chapter 7. I'm going to stop there on like the secular research and all that, but all you got to do is open up your eyes. You can see what this is doing for the world. It's such a pestilence. It's actually dividing our country politically. It's just insane what it's doing. And that unwin research, the book is called Sex and Culture, written in the 30s. This guy, across the board, when sexual revolution started, 3 generations later, that culture collapses. So, just take that for what it is. And that's why the next portion of the sermon is so important. Now, that's all the nasty stuff. I actually have one more thing that I want to bring up, and this is for real. Don't be sensitive. Don't follow your own heart on this stuff. And nobody is innocent on this. Nobody. It's so easy to play victim. It's so easy to say it was her fault or it was his fault. It's so easy to say it's society's fault. Society made me that way. It's so easy to say it's the woman you gave me, God. Just like Adam. And then Eve says, well, it was the serpent. What, did the serpent like crawl into your skin and start talking for you? No. None of us is innocent. So that's why I started the sermon. Don't be getting sensitive now. I speaketh to me like I speaketh to you. In 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 14, it says, for the unbelieving husband is sanctified by the wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified by the husband. Else were the children unclean, but now are they holy. Now, I want to bring a more broad, generic application of this. Now, the details being dealt with here are probably a pretty common thing in Corinth at the time. Now, the gospel is still pretty new, like in general. And then the Apostle Paul goes to Corinth, and many of you were lucky enough to hear the way Brother Anthony brought that to our attention. He described a lot of the cultural stuff and some of the history of how the Apostle Paul came to Corinth. But I'm not going to go into the detail there, but the Apostle Paul is addressing something that was probably pretty common, and that was that a lot of people were hearing about this gospel, the gospel of the Christ, and they say, "Well, I'm gonna obey that gospel." But then the wife would say, "Man, you're nuts. You're gonna go for this sect of the Nazarene? I mean, come on, we got Plato, we're Greeks. We got Plato and Aristotle and all that. We got Zeus and Hermes. That's where it's at. What are you going for this Christian garbage for?" And so there's probably a lot of arguments in the household because Corinthian people were saying, "Well, let's go for this Christ thing." And so marriages were hurting because of that. And so the Apostle Paul is advising here, you are able to help your unbelieving spouse. And then he actually brings in this statement, which to me ought to be very seriously considered by we Christians. Now, that's the more specific application, but the more broad application I want to bring to your ears right now is he says, "Else were your children unclean, but now are they holy." Now, that's not really a part of our culture anymore to look at children that way. But the way I want to apply it is so remarkable to me, and the opposite of marvelous, although I am marveled by this when I see it. And yeah, I have also done it myself, which is why I say I'm not innocent. None of us is innocent. But it blows my mind how often we prioritize, so many parents have prioritized their impulses and their selfishness above the well-being of their children. And that is one of the things that happens in the subject of marriage. People will just, "Well, hey, she's not doing what I want, so I'm going to go find somebody else." And what that does is it just contaminates and just thrashes the children involved. And this is horrific what's happening. And like I said, we all do it some way or another. But the Apostle Paul brings up children, and I think that we need to be way more considerate of what that does. Now, again, I'm going to get into the gospel side of this, but the amount of pain and agony children must go through because of this problem is something that I will never understand. But I can tell you this, that I pray every single day for children that I know of that are going through this kind of stuff. And that's all I'm going to say about that right now. So let me share with you what I believe is Paul's main theme in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. It's sprinkled throughout the whole chapter. I hit a couple highlights with it. 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 7. For I want all men to be even as I am, that every man has his proper gift of God, one after this manner, and another after that. It's really interesting to me. When you read this chapter, you will find interesting metaphorical statements being made. The Apostle Paul will almost seem like he switches the subject from talking about marriage, talking about something else. But it's all within the context of marriage. So he's using broad principles that are universally true, but he's using it in this context right here to make a point. So I want to consider that with you again. So we're in 1 Corinthians 7, verse 7. He says, I want all men to be even as I myself, but every man has his proper gift of God, one after this manner and another after that. That's interesting to me because obviously marriage is still going to be a part of human life. The only proper and acceptable way to practice reproduction is through the institution of marriage. Of course, the Apostle Paul is going to only support that style of having children. So it's not like he's going to say, no one getting married, thou shalt not get married. That's just ridiculous. That's not his point. When he was giving his advice, is actually one of the statements made here in this chapter. He says, I'm trying to spare you from a lot of heartache is what I'm trying to do. Like, I'm trying to help you. If that's your, if it don't work out that well for you, you know what I mean? If your last relationship was pretty rough, I can actually tell you a story about that right now. And this is the reality. This is the real stuff. I received a phone call. I won't tell you who I got this phone call from. I'm just going to share it with you because it's the kind of thing that the real application of these kinds of things happening in real life. So I'm going to share this with you. When my mom passed away, my dad just was a mess. Obviously, he just went through absolute despair. I'd never seen him even close to behave the way he was behaving. It was just unreal, the amount of pain and agony that he went through. And probably like 5 months after she had passed, something along those lines, some short period of time, he kind of went through this, pick himself up by his bootstraps, and he said, okay, I need to move on with my life. He started putting out dating feelers, started dating somebody, and then like, bam, I guess like he starts to get married, like real quick, super fast. And all my brothers struggled with it. I struggled with it too. It's like, like mom's like just got buried like not that long ago. This is kind of weird. But I got a phone call from somebody because my dad asked me to do the wedding. And I said, I can't do that. It's too much for me. I'll be there at the wedding, but I can't do the wedding. And I got a phone call from somebody, an older gentleman, older than me anyway. I ain't calling anybody old. And he actually says, tell you what, I'm an old guy like your dad, so I'll give you an old guy's perspective. And this particular individual I'm speaking about had a really, really rough bout with marriage. Just had a real rough marriage. And he said, you know what? When I have opportunity to remarry, I'm not so excited about the prospect of it. But the fact that your dad jumped into marriage so quickly shows you how good his relationship with your mom really was. Because no dude who went through a really horrible marriage, who has a head between his ears or a brain between his ears, is just gonna jump right back into it. Like, hey, let's see what happens. And he made this point to me, and among many other points. And so as a result, I did my father's wedding. It was one of the hardest things I've ever done. But the reason why I went into that was because the Apostle Paul is telling us in this verse right here, verse 7. Everyone's got their proper gift, like their proper calling, their proper purpose. Some people are going to have phenomenal relationships. Some people are going to fight to the death for their marriage. Some people aren't going to be so lucky. They're not all going to work out. My advice to you, if it didn't work out, don't do it again. That's my advice. This is my advice to you, But there are going to be some people who their relationship works out really great. I can tell you right now, if I wasn't happily married and have a couple of kids, they probably wouldn't have hired me for this church. If I was single, they'd be like, "What's wrong with this guy?" And I'm not joking. When I was 25 years old, before I got married, I was looking for a preaching position. I called, I don't know, 30, 50 churches. You know what they all said? "Oh, we're looking for somebody about 35 years old, married, and has kids." You know why? Because so many marriages are horrible right now and going through divorce. And they want somebody who can be an example, right? Let's just call it what it is. Apparently, my proper gift is to suffer through marriage. I'm just joking. It's wonderful. Oh, it's the best. I do want to make this statement. It's a precarious position that I am placed in to have to talk about this stuff. I have to get vulnerable. I have to say a lot of things I care not to say. But I want y'all to know, Laura is quite the trooper. Because I have to put her on the spot so often. And I have asked her many times in the midst of counseling people and helping people and preaching and teaching. And I've asked her, "Are you okay if I share some of the details of our relationship?" And she has never hesitated to say yes, as long as it's for the cause of Christ. And we had a rough first 7 years, and she has been very gracious to let me share some of those stories with some people. I'm not going to share any details right here, right now, but she has been very gracious. And then I say jokes like, I just said, the rough marriage, I had, suffer with marriage and all that, and but the truth is, God gave Laura and myself a good, happy marriage, and we learned more than we ever wanted to learn. And I do not say that lightly. I am not joking. There were times I did not know we were going to make it. Could not see a future. Somehow God got us through it. And for some people, the proper gift is going to be being able to do that. And it's not very glamorous. Not a glamorous position. The Apostle Paul, his calling was to stay single so he could really put God first. That was his calling. And he makes that clear in this context of this right here. He said his calling was to do that. It's really interesting the way it all works out, because I really believe, there's a couple of people here right now. If I wasn't married, would you have hired me? But nah, you by yourself, don't think so. It was a handsome boy right there that got married. Actually, didn't beat him yet. It was the pretty girl first. Anyway. All right, Dave, get on with it. Verse 20 to 24, I want to share with you before we bring this lesson to a close. Acts, 1 Corinthians 7, verse 20. Let every man abide in the same calling wherein he was called. Are you called while being a slave? Don't worry about it. If you are made free, use it rather. He that is called in the Lord being a slave is the Lord's freeman. Likewise, also he that is called being free is Christ's slave. You are bought with a price. Be not ye therefore the slaves of men. Brethren, let every man wherein he is called therein abide with God. That's an example of one of the interesting strategies that the Apostle Paul uses as he's talking about this subject suddenly he kind of makes this interesting shift. Right before this, he's talking about circumcision for some reason. He's using these things as an example. I do find it kind of interesting that the Apostle Paul uses marriage and compares it to being a slave. That's just really interesting when you really think about it. I'm not actually making a joke out of that. It's really interesting when you really look at that. He brings up being a slave as a representation and a parallel to the subject matter he's dealing with right here. So as he's talking about it, he says, whatever situation, wherever you are, whatever place Jesus has found you, make sure that you know and you understand one major thing, because nothing else really matters, whether you be married, happily married, or really struggling with the marriage, or divorced, or single, never been married, and wondering if you're ever going to find this special someone, widowed or not widowed, or whatever the situation might be. Know this one thing: you are bought with a price. You belong to God above all others. And nothing else is to really take precedence in your life. Let that be the main thing in your life, because too many people put too much weight on who they're going to be with for the rest of their life. They worry more about that than they worry about the God of heaven. They spend more time on dating websites than they do in the scriptures. More people spend more time worrying about their spouse than they do worrying about God, what God wants. That is going to be a problem that he actually addresses in this chapter. So I want to make this statement clear right here and right now, that really the main thing that the Apostle Paul wanted to get across here is, there's a lot of stuff involved with the subject of marriage, but no matter what, God needs to be number one in your life. So here's to kind of sum it up. Despite all the songs, all the romance songs, all the movies, all the chick flicks, and all the poems and poetry, and all the things, and all the dreams and the fantasies and the desires and whatever else exists, every single marriage is temporary. But your relationship with God, good or bad, is eternal. Keep that in your mind. And the rest of it really does take care of itself. So, if you haven't put God first in your life, come forth and make that done now while we stand.